Welcome to the What's Your Grief podcast. I'm Eleanor Haley.
And I'm Lisa Williams. We're the mental health professionals turned grief friends turned co-founders of the website What's Your Grief.
In this podcast, we talk candidly about all things grief, from pop culture to grief theory.
No tilted heads, no soothing tones, just us and our grief friends exploring the always devastating,
often confusing,
and sometimes even funny experience of living life after loss.
Hey, welcome to the What's Your Grief podcast. This is Eleanor, and as always, I'm joined by Lisa. Hi, Lisa.
Hey there.
How's it going? How was your birthday week?
Oh, my birthday week. My birthday week was not great. It was not great. I had a really bad chest infection that really decided to sort of hit peak intensity the night before my birthday. So I slept none. I felt awful. I had to start antibiotics and steroids and the whole thing. And it was just, it wasn't great. So all things considered, I think I made the best of it, but it was probably not one of my better birthdays. Just because I was sick and I think I had just been kind of stressed the last few weeks, but which is maybe why my immune system was not doing its best to handle my chest infection. But I read, I mentioned this to you, but I will say the one thing I did, since I was not really functional to do much else, was I read the book Wintering by Catherine May. As longtime listeners of the podcast will not be surprised to know, we are always sort of living in the shadow of dread of winter. And I had heard about her book, which is sort of about this idea of thinking about the natural cycle of the seasons and the natural cycle of winter as this time for kind of slowing down, and how she sort of draws this idea that there are periods of life where we have to winter, where we go through losses or illnesses or difficult things in life, and that the temptation is just to try to keep things going as they've always been, and that the reality is, in order to sort of actually restore ourselves and come out the other side of it, that we need to winter. And it's a really lovely book. I really, really liked it. I will say I read a number of very critical reviews that it feels a bit like it comes from a place of privilege, which is certainly true. She is able, the book draws on her own life experiences of her husband having an onset of an illness, her own illness, some issues with her son. And she has this flexibility to be able to take inordinate amounts of time off work and to do some traveling and things. And so there's definitely a component of her own story that is not necessarily fully relatable to everyone, but there's a lot. I think the book, in my mind, was much, much more than that. The thing that was valuable about the book was really more about the mindset shift in literal winter, as well as in these sort of figurative winters of these kind of difficult, dark times in our lives, of how do we shift from thinking that the optimal way of being is sort of our spring and summer being, and that we should always be trying to replicate that even in the winter when it's much harder, and instead saying no, the cycle of being in the world for all of the natural world is going through these cycles of nature, and we as humans are sort of more disconnected from it because we've been able to create a modern industrialized world that separates us from it and that allows us to access all the food and all the bright light and all the things all the time. But that there's probably lessons worth learning from this idea of embracing a slowing down and figuring out what that means and what that looks like and how one defines it so that they then can, I don't know, continue through this just natural cycle. And yeah, it's a lovely, but she's a beautiful writer, and she's also British. And so I think the time off component is very different compared to the US. I think if you're reading her book, it does feel a little bit more privileged from a US perspective, but in the UK, they have much more flexibility for time off for both physical health and mental health reasons than we do, that's guaranteed. And so I think, that piece of it is another part that I was mindful of the difference. But it is, if anyone is feeling the dread of winter that we always feel, I would definitely recommend it. It was the highlight of my birthday, was reading it.
I'm curious about that as somebody who, as you said, does not like winter. And I do recognize that a major piece of that is mindset. Like, hence the fact that I start dreading it in September. Like, the minute summer ends, I start dreading it. So I definitely think that, your takeaway feels valuable to me. I think, I want to think about that. Like, how am I really conceptualizing like how I should exist my day to day over winter? Like, obviously, historically, we've had to slow down. We did a lot of work in preparation for the winter because we knew we'd have to slow down. And you're right, nowadays, like we can go to the grocery store and get our food, and we have access to that, and we can still do our work all winter long, and we're not like animals who go to sleep for an entire winter, which actually might be not a bad idea. But I do think maybe part of my issue is sometimes a little bit of self-criticism about how I am existing in the winter and how I'm not active or getting enough sunlight or, getting out of the house and things like that. And so I do kind of like the idea of maybe examining how I am looking at things when it comes to winter. So I might have to check that out.
I mean, I really, there were a lot of things that made me think about just how, even just like simple things about just how we can view winter as this time in life that we can really think about the things inside of our house that we want to do and the things that feel, I don't know, maybe like we've pushed them aside during the other times of year for various reasons when it's light out later and things like that. And just like that slowing, kind of embracing a slowing down and really being mindful and thoughtful about it. It's the exact opposite, I think, of how typically I approach the winter, which is what I often do, is I start by being like, oh my gosh, what can I commit myself to doing out of the house at night? Like, how can I like sign up for a class I have to pay for that will force me to actually go? How can I like do all of these things to try to resist the idea that I will kind of be confined and hunkered down in my house? So it sounds so simple, but it really was this moment where I thought, wow, I guess I've never really critically assessed whether that is the most helpful way for me to approach it. Like, is there, or even really considering like, is there another way, or what would it look like if I approached it differently? And I do have some friends. I was just talking to a friend who like loves the winter so much and is so excited for when the days start to get shorter and the nights start to get longer, and is like out with all the needlepoint and every warm winter recipe that they're ready to make and all the, just sort of like waiting for that. And the book just sort of, it did make me reflect on maybe, would it change my relationship with the winter if I did do some things that looked at it like that? I don't know.
If you embraced it embraced like, I've been thinking about that a little bit, like just being realistic, because I don't like to push myself out of the house in the winter. I think a lot of it is because I have constantly like 5-year-old with me. So it's like not just my like warm clothes and boots and all that, it's hers too. And getting in car seats, things like that. It just, when it's cold, it just like, I don't want to do all that as much. So I have been thinking a lot about like, okay, how can I make my house feel as cozy as possible and as inviting as possible? I was literally just Googling it yesterday, like ways to make my house more cozy and inviting. And so I do think that I can definitely see embracing that side of things. Like, okay, let me like recognize that I'm going to be in the house more often, and I'm going to be, limited in where I'm going and how am I going to get my exercise, knowing I'm not going to be able to go outside and like go for a walk or a hike or whatever, thinking about those types of things. So yeah, just like accepting it. Acceptance. I feel like that's a big piece here.
Right. And the part of the book that drew the parallel to grief or just times of, she talks about it as any difficult time. Like that was so intuitive to me because it was what we say all the time, which is like, be kind and gentle with yourself. Like give yourself permission to say no and slow down and, know that you need to, you're not going to like snap out of it and go back to normal like everybody's pressuring you to do. And it's okay to embrace who you are as you grieve and what your needs are and create, the support that you need through that. So it's interesting because that part was really, really intuitive to me. And I was like, no, of course. It was the actual literal winter part that was a leap for me.
Yeah, I do think the permission is such a big piece of that because my evidence for this is the fact that like during COVID, I just existed in a lot of ways that I wanted to, and I didn't feel bad about it because like I didn't have another choice. And I think because you feel like you should be doing something differently or you're missing out on something or there's another choice you could be making that would be better for you. I feel like for me personally, that's where a lot of my unhappiness comes from. And when I'm like, no, I don't have any other choices, that feels like better. So yeah, it's a delicate balance finding that space where, I don't know, where you take comfort in what winter has to offer, while also, I don't know, trudging through some of the grayness.
Yeah, that you have to do. I mean, that right, absolutely. Like you can't just hibernate. And this isn't exactly what we're talking about today, but I do think there's, I don't know, there's just some interesting parallels because we, what we wanted to talk about today on the podcast was this idea of sort of thinking about, does anything go in grief? Like we say all the time that grieving is unique, or sometimes you'll see on social media, there's no wrong way to grieve, just kind of lean into whatever your grief process is. And what does that really mean? I mean, I think in a lot of ways it came up as this helpful response or kind of antidote to this idea of, there's 5 stages and you have to do this and you have to do that. And it looks universal and everybody should do these things. And then it was like the pendulum swung to this other place. But what does that really mean for us? And there are ways I see parallels in just thinking about how we cope with all different seasons of life and moments and things that we're doing.
Yeah. So the reason that this came up recently, I mean, this is probably something we've been kind of talking about and mulling over for a long time. But the reason this came up recently was someone had shared an article in our professional grief community, or what is it? Our community for grief professionals.
Grief professionals. Yeah. Not like you're a professional full-time griever, but you are a grief professional.
I mean, well, aren't we all professional full-time grievers? We sure are.
Life is pretty much just, the older you get, it does feel like just becoming a professional griever. So true.
So they posted an article, and the title of the article was, "Is it true there are no right or wrong ways to grieve?" That was basically the article. And it was kind of examining this, you can call it what you want, platitude, saying, wisdom, cliche, however it hits you. And it was sort of examining this notion that has become really popular in the narrative around grief and grieving. And the article, there's a lot of points it makes, but I think in the end, what it comes around to saying, actually, I'll read you a quote. It's kind of funny. There are many right ways to grieve and also many wrong ways to grieve. Consequently, there is no single right way to grieve and no single wrong way to grieve. And I'm like, okay, yes, thank you. But I think, my thought on this is that if you look at the question, like, are there no right ways and no wrong ways to grieve? Like, my answer every time is there is no right way to grieve. Like, there is no right way to grieve. There's no prescribed way to grieve. There's no set of stages. There's no steps. There's nothing you should or have to do to grieve. You don't need to cry. You don't need to talk it all out. There are a lot of different ways that people grieve in a healthy way. So I think in terms of like that half of the question, there are no right ways to grieve. So then we are at the set part of that question is like, are there wrong ways to grieve? And so I think where that one gets tricky is that there are ways that people respond to grief that can be less than helpful, that can be harmful, that are not constructive, that cut them off from the world, people, their values, things that they care about. So though there is no prescribed way to grieve, and I have said there's no right or wrong way to grieve, and I'll probably say it again, there are ways that people respond to grief that are not necessarily healthy or good for them. So that's kind of where I land at. How about you?
Yeah.
Would you agree?
No, I mean, I think we had similar responses reading that article because it sort of said what I imagine a lot of us would think already, which is there's no, like you said, there's no required right way, but most of us have times in our lives, grief related and otherwise, where we reflect back on a time and we go like, oh, wow, I was making decisions that were probably not really helping me. They may have been harming me. Like I was doing things that in the moment felt good, but maybe in the long term were bad for me or were problematic for me. I think that we often have recognition that unfortunately when we're in it, it's really hard to see what's going on sometimes. It's really hard for us to know, this is why I love my therapist, right? Like I love having somebody else who can sometimes push the perspective around and be like, well, like, what about this other thing? Because a lot of times that's really hard for us to see. So I think for me, it was like, well, yeah, of course, right? Like at any moment in life, there are no objective, it's like winter. There's no objective, like right or wrong way to handle the winter. But are there some winters where I've like done a better job caring for myself than others? Definitely. Are there probably things that I could do that I have done that are really harmful? Yeah, probably. And so I think one of the things that's happened, I don't know, maybe it's like in social media culture or this discussion around grief, I do think there's this fear of sounding prescriptive and saying, oh, you have to do this or you have to do that. There is a right way. That then we've assumed that the opposite also must be
right.
Nothing is ever problematic or harmful or wrong. Well, like, no, I think most of us would say we've gone through moments where we've done some stuff in our coping that has been kind of harmful to us. Yeah. And that's okay. That's not like a failure. That's not anything, it's usually something that we learn from and hopefully we get a little better as we go. I mean, that's part of the process. Yeah. So that was kind of my thought.
I think one of the things that makes it this hard to talk about, especially in Instagram soundbite, lack of nuance sort of way, is that a lot of responses and things we do to cope with grief are healthy to a point. A lot of the things that we employ could go either way. There's a few that we would always say like, no, bad idea. But I think that most things exist in this place where there's a lot of gray area. An example we often use is avoidance. because interestingly, like avoidance, you know, when we think about it in relation to people who are really struggling with things like anxiety and depression, avoidance is like a bad guy. Avoidance is kind of lies at the heart of a lot of struggles that people have because we, you know, might be avoiding feeling a certain way. We might be avoiding certain people, places, and things that make us feel a certain way. People end up cutting themselves off from life, cutting themselves off from experiences, cutting themselves off from the things that they value, and they never learn how to cope with the experiences. They never learn how to cope with that emotion, or they never go to that place to learn that they can handle how they will feel when they get to that place, or they never have that tough conversation. Instead, they just throw the relationship away. And so avoidance can cause a lot of problems because it really gets in the way of our lives and our day-to-day functioning, and we never really learn how to handle it if we're avoiding. And what does that mean? It means we have to keep running, right? We have to keep engaging in this avoidance if we're never going to turn around and kind of confront and cope with the situation at hand. So avoidance is a big troublemaker. But the thing is, avoidance is also something that we as humans do all the time in doses. And it's something that in grief can actually be really useful when we're not doing it in this chronic way that leads to, you know, this ongoing cycle of avoidance. In fact, our favorite grief theory, well, one of our favorite grief theories, the dual process model, actually advocates for avoiding our grief at times because maybe we need just a respite from confronting it, right? Because it is emotionally and physically exhausting at times. And also there's so much we have to do in our lives. Like we said earlier, like grief does not exist in this bubble. It exists within the context of our ongoing life, which doesn't stop, unfortunately, even though I wish it did, when we experience loss. And so we still have to do things on a day-to-day basis. And maybe we now have to fill new roles and new responsibilities. And so at times we do have to avoid the emotion of grief because we have to be able to focus on other things. So avoidance is something that is actually kind of helpful in doses. It's when we get to a place where we're employing it as our go-to coping tool, our only coping tool, and that's really dictating our way of life. But where is that tipping point? It can be hard to see it. You know, some behaviors that exist as perfectly normal, reasonable, constructive things, like, for example, parenting while grieving. If you throw all your energy into taking care of your kids, that is something that's very adaptive, very normal, very instinctual in many ways. But if that becomes a way over time that you avoid your grief, then we get into this territory where it's actually not helpful. You know, we still need to parent always, but we need to be mindful of the balance. And I think that's why it can be really tough sometimes, is because it's like, where's that tipping point? Where is that line that goes from constructive to not so helpful?
Yeah, and I think there's no easy answer. There's a concept I really like that is sort of helping to give language to, I think, exactly what you're describing, to which is in the early days of grief, that certain things are really helpful for coping that actually over the long term become barriers to adapting or integrating our grief in the long term. And you know, so I think there's sort of that scale of degree that you're talking about a little bit. Like we can have some avoidance or temporary avoidance, but we don't want it to be chronic. And then I think something else that timeline looks at is saying, well, sometimes the things that immediately after the loss are really helpful for our just survival. Like you're in that early grief. I'm just trying to get through the day to day, just take care of myself, figure out what my needs are, figure out how I'm going to survive in the world after this devastating event. And some of the things that really, really help us then over the long term actually end up being things that sometimes keep our world really small, that keep us in that self-protective place to such a degree that it was really important in the beginning to be in that really self-protective place. But ultimately, to integrate our loss and to figure out how to adapt and rebuild, we have to learn how to open ourselves back up again. And that often requires pushing ourselves into new territory that doesn't always feel comfortable. So I don't think there's an easy answer to any of it to know, but I do think part of it is that self-reflection question. I think the thing that worries me sometimes when we hear that language of like, it's always, at kind of that anything goes, or it's unique, so it's different for all of us, is it doesn't help us to figure out what questions do we need to ask ourselves. Like, how do I check in with myself as time is passing, or as I'm engaging in certain things in my grief? How do I know what to ask myself to try to figure out where I am on that spectrum of avoidance, or, some of those things like coping early that can be helpful, but isn't necessarily adaptive in the long term.
Yeah, we have a couple of questions I think that we've shared before that I think can be kind of helpful in thinking this through. And again, you said that's what this is what you use your therapist for. And I do think like that can be helpful. Having an outsider's perspective, it can be so hard to see the forest for the trees when you're in the middle of things. And so I do think having someone to like really talk through these things, and maybe even if it's not a therapist, maybe a friend who will be honest with you. Journaling, always a good space for people who don't want to talk to other people. Totally understandable. But yeah, there are just like a couple of questions that I think are kind of helpful in assessing this. And I think the most obvious question is whether or not the response is causing harm to oneself or to other people. Like that's always going to be the most obvious question. And I think when we get into a few other like questions, we'll see that, this could be more subtle. When we're talking like this first question, it's like, are you noticing that you're like physically doing harm to your body? Are you abusing substances in a way that's really harmful to your body? Are you engaging in self-harm? Things like that. Or is a behavior causing harm to others? And that could look a number of different ways, but maybe, are you neglecting completely your parenting responsibilities and your kids aren't getting taken care of? Things like that. And those I think can feel like, I don't know, a little more obvious or extreme circumstances. Yeah. So I think that that's like the most obvious question, but it's also the one that I feel like can be more easy to identify. Maybe not always, but often.
Yeah, I think sometimes it definitely can. I think there are other times where we're in that slightly gray area where it can be hard to see it. I mean, I certainly think I look at times for myself where it was in a gray area, right? I mean, even going back to when my dad died at the end of my freshman year in college. And there is no question to me looking back now that like, I probably wasn't using alcohol in the healthiest of ways at that time, but I was also in college. So it was really easy to sort of distort it within a culture where like drinking a time of life when, depending on where you are in your life, where that's more normalized. And so it was easy for me to not be honest with myself.
Yeah, that sort of connects a little bit to the next one in my mind. A question that I, encourage people to ask is whether the response is causing you personal distress. And the reason that connects is because I've shared this on the podcast before. I stopped drinking completely because I got to a place where I felt personally distressed about it. It wasn't that I had gotten into this place where I was physically dependent or that I was necessarily doing it every day, though I was doing it a lot of days. I got to a place where I was like, this feels bad for me personally. Like I haven't crossed some threshold where someone else needs to tell me. I haven't, gotten to a place where other people are saying, I think you need to stop. But like, I'm personally distressed with how I feel in the morning, how I feel about my control over this behavior. And so that was the point where I felt like I needed to stop. And so the reason I bring this up is because a lot of times I think people do think that things need to get to this extreme place in order for it to be something that they find a coping tool for, that they want to get help with, that they can go talk to a therapist about. And we always encourage people, like, if you're experiencing personal distress around this, then that is enough to seek out that support and that help and that tool or whatever it is to be able to address it. And in grief, a lot of things feel very personally distressing, right? And overwhelming. And so thinking about this in terms of like grief emotions, I would encourage people to think like as time goes on, is there something that you're continuing to really, really personally struggle with? It's keeping you awake at night. Maybe it's coming up in your dreams. Maybe it's something that you continue to go back to. Maybe it's a place you're too afraid to go to. And so is that something that you might want to look for a tool to address? Maybe it is something like journaling or talk to a therapist about, because for you, it is continuing to cause a personal level of distress.
Yeah. And I think that is one of those things where being able to just be honest with ourselves can be hard, because sometimes it's both. Like sometimes it's causing us distress and comfort at the same time. That's why it has emerged the way that it has. And so I think that's one of the things that is important too, is to go, it doesn't have to be exclusively distressing. There's a lot of things that are both really comfortable and really distressing. And so being able to go, talking to somebody or addressing this, looking at it, examining it isn't necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think I want to say this actually came up on the last podcast, but maybe I'm imagining that. But this is something that I've talked about and relate to very deeply, because I love comfort. I choose comfort. I mean, literal comfort, softness, coziness, warmth, always. And I came to a point, I don't know when it was, but I wrote an article about it. I could probably like look at the date of that, where I was like, I am always opting for this over things that I think would be meaningful to me in life, like leaving the house where it's not warm. Speaking of the winter theme, getting out and pushing myself to get 30 minutes of exercise, because that is like literally what my doctor tells me I need to do. And so that brings me to another question I think that we need to ask ourselves. And that question is this response getting in the way of the way we either need to live, like our day-to-day life, right? Like the things we have to do. Is this getting in the way of us being able to just function? Or a more subtle question is this getting in the way of us living a life in accordance with the things we value or want for ourselves, our relationships, our whatever it is that's important to us? Is this getting in the way of that? Because there's often, a way that we can live that feels relatively comfortable, but that doesn't quite fill up our cup, or that doesn't quite help us to feel like we're really connecting with purpose or with things that are important to us or with our loved one. Maybe it's that our continued bond with our loved one that we would like to have is something we don't feel connected with. And I think, again, in the early days, when we're really just worried about survival and safety and all of our basic needs, this may feel like less of a consideration and less of a concern. But I do think as time passes and we are kind of rebuilding what our life looks like, this becomes more of a question.
Yeah, I think this is one of those questions that really kind of coping versus adapting, or like that really, it jumps out for me with this, because a lot of times in the early days, we just want to surround ourselves with people, places, and things that are supporting us in our deepest pain, and that sometimes means we distance ourselves from people who we feel like don't understand our grief. We just want the people around us who we know how to say and do all of the right things or have really shown up for us. We really think about how we can avoid certain places that are really kind of activating and overwhelming, or where we feel like we're just not ready to be there because of how overwhelmed with grief we feel, or triggered we feel. And all of that in the early days makes so much sense that we do that. But then when we look at things over the long term, if we continue and that never changes, and we don't start to think about what it means to open back up again, then sometimes we're not necessarily in like distress, because we've kind of built a little comfort bubble where it's like, well, I just got the people who get it, and I just am going to the places that feel comfortable. But my life has become really small, and other things that I value maybe feel really distant. Relationships that were once really important to me feel like they've, faded away and become more distant. Things I used to be engaged in, or things that I want to be engaged in, maybe I am not exploring them because I feel worried I won't be able to cope. I'm not sure about it, whatever that is, those anxieties that are there. And so all of a sudden we can get to this place where we start to realize, when we ask ourselves the values question, like, are there certain things that I once valued, or that I would like to connect with and value, that I'm cutting myself off from? And what does that mean? What do I do about that if I realize that that's a piece of where I am in my grief? And it's tricky, right? Because it highlights that it's changing with time. Like, the answer can be at one moment that, like, yes, this is helping me and this is important. And then in another moment of like, oh, wait, this is disconnecting me. And now I feel actually worse from doing the exact same thing that before was helping me to feel safe and protected.
Well, and going back a little bit to what you said before about how sometimes we're getting that comfort, we're getting like that positive emotion from our typical daily routines. And at the point you're talking about, where you might say to yourself, like, okay, wait, I want to actually like reconnect with my faith community that I've been avoiding because going to church makes me sad, or, things like that. That's a point that can be a little bit frightening and scary, because you may need to face something that you have been avoiding, or that you haven't pushed yourself through yet. You may need to have experiences that are really tough. And when the comfort of your typical daily routines and couch and soft things, like I'm speaking for myself here, is calling to you, that feels like so much easier. And it feels like it can even trick you a little bit into thinking, well, that feels bad and scary, and this feels good, so this has to be right. Right. But then I think deep down, a lot of people struggle with that feeling like, no, I feel like I want something more, or something new, or something else in my life. I'm not completely where I want to be, or totally satisfied or connected. I'm having these other feelings that are pushing me to want to connect in other ways. And so I do think, like, to recognize that it's normal for it to be scary and feel painful and unpleasant. It's like, it's worth pushing. Going back to that winter thing, like, maybe it's for me worth putting on the warm pants and the boots for me and my 5-year-old in order to go do that thing once in a while. Though I can accept, that it's not as much as in the summertime. It's worth it at times if it's really important to me. And so I think, recognizing that it's not always going to be obviously like the right path. It's not just going to like open up and be like, oh, okay, yes. Perfect. Easy. Obvious.
Yeah. I think this connects to a question Anne asked in the comments about what you do or how you handle it when people who you haven't maybe seen since the funeral haven't reached out to ask how you're doing. And what do you say? How do you manage that? How do you handle that situation? And I think it's a really good question, because related to this topic, because sometimes in the early days, right, it's really comfortable to go, okay, they're not reaching out to me. I'm staying in my comfort zone of just people who intuitively know how to support me. I don't have to ask for anything. I just kind of stay in this place. And then as time passes, it becomes more complicated because those can be people sometimes who we really care about, who we really miss, who otherwise in other moments in our lives have been really wonderful friends. And sometimes when we realize like, wow, I feel a sense of loss around this. I want to reconnect with this person. But there does feel like there's a discomfort or an awkwardness because of this distance that has emerged, in part because they probably pulled away for whatever their reasons of discomfort were around grief. And you probably leaned into that because, you know, we create comfort bubbles where it's hard. We're like, I can't even begin to think about reaching out. And so then sometimes we have to be in the discomfort space where we have the uncomfortable conversation, or we make the uncomfortable decision to reach out, to take the first step, maybe to acknowledge and talk about that it has felt weird and hard because you haven't heard from them. Maybe not. I think that's really up to you. I think that goes right back to that question of, is there a right or a wrong way? I don't think there is. I think there's plenty of people who are like, in order for me to reestablish a relationship with somebody where it got distant in the depth of my grief, I feel like we have to acknowledge that like they didn't show up and I felt unsupported. And like for some people, that's really important. And for other people, they're like, you know what? Like they weren't in a place where they could support me. I wasn't in a place where I could like give them the feedback that I would have needed to give them, to direct them. And so now at this point, I am willing to kind of just reach out and view the past as water under the bridge. And now we pick up from here and see what happens. There's no like one way of reestablishing relationships when they have drifted, if they're important to you. But it often in some ways does mean there is some of that discomfort, either in the like, okay, now I'm the one taking the first step to reach out when it's been a long time, or I'm reaching out and we're going to have a conversation that maybe feels a little awkward. But oftentimes, you know, I love Pauline Boss talks about this a lot in Ambiguous Grief, this idea that there's value in the tension that sometimes happens in particular moments. Like when we avoid tension, it's often because we're trying to shield ourselves from anything that's even a little bit uncomfortable. But oftentimes, if we can get through some of those difficult conversations, tense moments of discomfort, then we end up with a stronger relationship, or at least a restored relationship with people. You know, again, there's so many like nuances to that. There's no easy answer because everybody's relationships are different. But in the context of what we're talking about here, that's one of the things that comes to mind for me.
I mean, I think it just speaks to the subtlety of how some of this how, like you said, nuance some of this self-examination can become. Like there are things that are pretty obvious. Like, is this getting in the way of my day-to-day life? I can't drive over the bridge where my loved one had their accident. So now I'm having to drive 2 hours out of my way to get to work. Like that is a very clear cut, like, yeah, it's really impacting your day-to-day life, right? Things like that are pretty obvious. But yeah, when you get down to these things of like, what do I want? And who am I? And what do I value? That can be such a really difficult and individual and unique thing to navigate. And it's really only for you to figure out. No one can tell you. And so I do think like there is probably also a layer to this of assessing how you are doing and what you do want speaks a little bit to the inner critic in that self-criticism and judgment that we might do. Because I do think that there are probably times where we're like, oh, well, I haven't reconnected with all these people. And if I cared about people, or if I were somebody who had a lot of friends or was good at relationships, I would have these people in my life still. Or things like, oh, I need to go back to that place because I always used to go to that place. And so I should go to that place. And so I think an important layer of this is acknowledging that sometimes we engage in this self-examination and self-assessment and say to ourselves, like, actually, no, like that place doesn't need to be a part of my day-to-day life. I don't need to go back to that place. My old self went there for a reason, and I've changed, and now it doesn't serve a purpose for me. Maybe in the future that will change, but as of now, I don't need to go through that hard experience just to connect with something that doesn't make sense for me anymore. And the same, like you said, can hold true for relationships. There might be relationships that are not worth keeping. They don't make sense anymore. And that sometimes feels like bad, like it's a secondary loss. Maybe we feel like, whether are we doing the wrong thing by not maintaining this relationship? But sometimes that's the right answer. The relationship no longer makes sense. But then, like you said, there are some relationships that are either worth the tension and worth the stress of saving, or there are the ones where it's just awkward. And it's like, you know what, if one of us reaches out, the ice will immediately feel broken and we'll be okay. It does happen. So I do think, again, it's like, it's such a subtle difference, some of these things, and it can be really hard to know. But I do think that it's important to note that a part of this is really asking, like, what actually is right for my life now, and pushing back against that critic or that inner drill sergeant who's like, no, you need to go back to doing things exactly the way it was, or having all these things back in your life, because maybe not. Maybe it's that you want to start connecting with something totally new, and that's the thing that you want to push yourself towards.
Yeah, I think that you described that perfectly, and it can be easier said than done to know that in certain moments. You know, it's often a question of really exploring it for ourselves and looking at where we are and revisiting it time and again, because again, it keeps evolving, it keeps changing with time. And there may be things right now where we say, you know what, I really don't feel, it doesn't feel important to go back to that place, or reconnect with that person. And then in 2 years from now, something changes in your life, something changes in where you are, and suddenly that place does feel important to you again, or that person does, or, so it's always evolving.
Yeah. So, I think that we've provided people with a couple of questions that they can ask themselves if this is something that they are wondering about for themselves. I think, to answer the original question, I think, like we said, there is no way to grieve. There's no right way to grieve. There's no wrong way to grieve, but there are certain things that might not be consistent with the life we'd like to lead, that are healthy for us. And so we want to be mindful of those things and not necessarily just say yes to everything, because there are certainly times where things can be harmful to ourselves and the life that we would like to be living. And so if you have any questions or thoughts, you can always email us at whatsyourgrief@gmail.com. And we will be back again next week